Hi there, welcome back to this week's edition of Get Me Right, your favorite deep dive show on things contemporary and consequential. This coming week would mark 1 year of the October 7 terror attack carried out by Hamas in southern Israel last year, which killed 1,200 plus Israeli citizens, has left 100 still hostage with them, and started the wider Israel-Hamas war. The hostilities have seen 40,000 and more Palestinians killed, and the Israel-Hamas war has now widened into a regional conflict threatening global peace. Iran shot off nearly 200 missiles last week on military targets inside Israeli territory in response to Israel's elimination of Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah on September 27 in Lebanon. What started the conflict? September 27 or October 7? The first Intifada in 1987 or the second one in the year 2000? Nakba in 1948, as the Palestinians want us to believe, or the UN partition plan of Palestine in 1947, or even before that, the Palestine mandate of the League of Nations to the British in 1922. Was it the Nazi genocide of Jews that sowed the seeds of a Jewish resurrection, or the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which promised setting up of a homeland for the Jews? Or perhaps none of these. What started it all, perhaps, was a prophet's dream a millennium ago. Aren't you already confused? Stay on for an exciting lowdown on the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Prophet Muhammad had a dream in which he traveled on a street called Burak from Mecca to Jerusalem, where he prayed at the ruins of the Temple of Solomon with earlier prophets, Moses, Jesus, and Abraham by his side. On the way, he visited Mount Sinai, where Moses had received his commandments from God, and Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. This story of Al-Isra and Al-Miraj in Islam talks of the prophet then ascending the heavens and getting an audience with God before returning back to Mecca, all in the same night. Irrespective of whether the prophet traveled in body or mind for this fantastic journey, this story became the basis for the Muslim claims to the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock, the holiest sites for the original inhabitants of the land, the Jews in Jerusalem. This could be seen as Muhammad's attempt at synthesis with the Abrahamic faiths that existed before Islam in the geography. What it did instead was create a claim in perpetuity for the Muslims over what had been the holy site of the Temple Mount for the Jews for 2 millennia before the advent of Islam. Also for Christians, as we know, Jerusalem is associated with many aspects of the life of Jesus. Thus, while it could have been the basis for coming together of the three major religions of the world, the territory with competing claims of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the story has become the genesis for what we now call the West Asia conflict, or the Israel-Palestine conflict. Let's go deeper. The first mosque at the site of the Temple Mount came up during the first caliphate under Umayyad rule during or immediately after the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad. The mosque, now called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was built and rebuilt during the 4 centuries of Rashidun caliphates, from the Umayyads and Abbasids to Fatimids. The Crusades of 11th century turned the mosque into a church again, with the compound acting as a palace for the Knight Templar, only to go back to being a mosque a century later with the Ottoman conquest of Jerusalem, which the Muslims also call Baitul Muqaddas. There's a parallel Judeo-Christian history of the conflict. The followers of the Christ, the Christians, considered Jews as guilty of the original sin of Christ's betrayal. The atavism of that sentiment got reflected in many violent periods between the two faiths, including during Crusades, when, though the original target was the overthrow of the Muslim rule, Jews were equally targeted if they came in the crosshairs of the Crusaders. Like in 1095 AD or Common Era, The first crusade ordered by Pope Urban II ended up killing over 2,000 Jews. That anti-Semitism is what found expression in the darkest period of European history by way of the Nazi Holocaust. But I will come to that in a bit. In modern era, at the turn of the 19th century, in what constitutes the historical Palestine or today's Israel, there were not more than 20 to 30,000 Jews around Jerusalem. As a corollary, most of the Palestinians were Muslims. The rest of the Jews were scattered all over the world, having lost the promised land of Canaan, the biblical name of Israel, to Muslim conquest over centuries. We know of the Bene Israel community of Jews in India, for example. But a majority of Jews lived in Europe. Exclusionary nationalist movements in much of the 19th century Europe to pogroms in Orthodox Russia crystallized Jewish nationalism, which ultimately took the shape of Zionism and the yearning for the promised land of Israel. In the 2 decades up to the First World War, Jewish migration from Europe saw their population in Ottoman Palestine increase from 3% in 1890 or thereabout to 7% just before the war. Amidst a weakening Ottoman Empire, West Asia, like much of the rest of the world, was divided into spheres of influence between the colonial parts, with what is Lebanon today coming under the French and the Palestinian territory becoming the British mandate. The war cabinet of Prime Minister H.H. Asquith set up a committee to look into the future of post-war Ottoman territories, including Palestine, in 1915. The work of the committee and some personal push from the next Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, led to the British government pushing the idea of a national home for the Jews by way of the Balfour Declaration, in the name of Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour in 1917. For all practical purposes, the Balfour Declaration can be seen as the modern genesis of the Israel-Palestine conflict as we know it today. The official declaration of a homeland for the Jews enthused much of the Jewish citizenry across Europe. Parallelly, Nazi anti-Semitism was fueling Zionist sentiments. Holocaust made the return of the Jews a necessity. Well, actually, it's in the book. Bible says that the gathering of Israel is a precondition for the second coming of Christ. So in a way, it's a Judeo-Christian imperative. The period of the British mandate from 1920 to 1947 saw waves of Jewish immigration into Palestine. From being a fifth at the time of Balfour Declaration in 1917, Jews became roughly equal in numbers to Muslims in Palestine by the end of the World War II. This mass migration saw the fueling of Arab-Palestinian nationalism. Arabs revolted against the British in 1936, making them stop Jewish migration, which in turn prompted the Jews to rebel against the British this time. While the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947 talked about a two-state solution, one Jewish and one Arab, thus being acceptable to the Jews because it gave them a state, the division of the territory itself was such that the Arabs rejected it, and war broke out between them and the newly formed Jewish state of Israel in 1948. Jordan occupied territories in the West Bank and Egypt took over Gaza. After a year and expulsion of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians, Arabs sued for peace. But the armistice signed in 1949 to end the war only bought a tenuous peace, which broke again in 1956 with the Suez Crisis and 1967 with what is called the Six-Day War, with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan collectively taking on Israel. Israel not only defeated but occupied the territories of Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and West Bank and Gaza Strip from the three respectively. This again led to displacement of about 300,000 Palestinians from the newly occupied territories into Egypt, Syria, and mainly Jordan. 1967 was followed by the Yom Kippur War in 1973, with both sides again suffering heavy casualties, though yet again Israel came out trumps, despite the surprise attack on the Jewish holiday. Call it war fatigue or realization that the Arabs couldn't match Israeli conventional military might. Camp David Accords were signed in 1978, brokered by the United States between Egypt and Israel, getting a Nobel for peace to their respective leaders, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. With Jordan, Egypt, and Syria settling their positions with Israel, the Palestinian resistance morphed first into a guerrilla movement led by Fatah under Yasser Arafat, and subsequently, with increasing radicalization, turning into a mass terror network under Hamas. It is an interesting subset of the regional Gulf politics that while a Sunni Hamas has had a love-hate relationship with the Sunni Arab states, a Shia Iran has been a permanent backer of their cause, propping up other proxies like the Hezbollah and Houthis, muddying the waters and making the conflict intractable. Under international pressure, Israel also turned accommodative, allowing PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, to set up a national government in West Bank and Gaza following the first Intifada years. 1993 also saw Oslo Accords being signed, this time with Clinton mediating, which brought Nobel Peace Prizes for Arafat and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres. But those hardly brought peace on the ground again. Rabin, in fact, was assassinated in 1995 by a far-right Israeli citizen, and the Palestinian Authority of Fatah increasingly lost ground to terror group Hamas in Gaza, leading to the second Intifada in the year 2000. Hamas even won the 2006 elections, briefly resulting in the talk of a three-state solution: Israel, Gaza Strip under Hamas, and the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. So yes, October 7 attack last year by Hamas in southern Israel is not the genesis of what we are seeing panning out before our eyes. It was just one event in a continuum of conflict and violence that goes back a millennium and more. What's the way out? Since I began with ancient times, let me go back there for a relook at possibilities. Incidents during the life of Prophet Muhammad themselves set the tone for the Islamic world's larger relationship with the Israeli nation. Upon his migration from Mecca to Medina, the initial engagement between the Prophet and the Jews was cordial to the extent that Muhammad's secretary, who inscribed much of the Quran, was a Jew by the name of Zayd bin Thabit, who of course later converted to Islam. The Covenant of Medina was signed between the Muslims and the Jews, giving some period of peace. But it was not long before the gloves were off between the two monotheistic faiths. So much so that a good part of surahs or chapters, Al-Nisa and Al-Hashr in the Quran, are dedicated to chastening the Jews for not accepting Muhammad as their prophet in line with Moses or Jesus. Post the victory in the Battle of Badr, a resurgent Muslim nation started resetting the terms of engagement beyond the Covenant of Medina. The murder of Jewish poet Ka'b for his poetry against Islam, the blockade and expulsion of the Jewish tribes of Banu Qaynuqa and Banu al-Nadir left Medina essentially a Muslim city, with most of its Jewish population expelled. After the Meccan siege of Medina, the final showdown between Muslims and Jews saw the blockade of the last surviving tribe of Banu Qurayza and their execution in the presence of Prophet Muhammad himself. This at least proves a couple of things beyond debate. One, Jews have a civilizational right over the land of Israel, which predates the advent of Islam by at least 2 millennia. Two, for a good 1,000 years and more, followers of Islam occupied the same territory and hence have domiciliary right over it. You can even call it civilizational now. Like the Palestinians were evicted by use of force in 1948, so the Jews would have been expelled brutally in the 7th century, like the example of Banu Qurayza shows. Just that it did not happen in front of our eyes or in front of cameras. So the zero-sum game we are seeing in the Middle East in the present is ingrained in the history of the religions. When you hear this slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine would be free," and read meaning into it, it is a call for the extermination of the state of Israel, which cannot happen unless you remove all its citizens, the Jews, which obviously is not a peace plan. If Israel fails to win, it loses its existence, so it must survive. But if it survives, Palestine cannot exist. This history is important for it to be reiterated and retold. In the mainstream media in the West, perhaps out of their guilt for creating this mess in the first place, Israel gets unduly panned. The Palestinians have had at least half a dozen rounds of good opportunities to have settled for peace, but the extremist elements have prevailed. Hamas, having greater control than the national authority over agenda setting and narrative building, is proof of that. I mentioned earlier how post the Camp David and Oslo Accords, the Arab nations have consistently sought peace in the region, and in effect disengaged from the narrow Palestinian cause since at least 2002, only to be restricted by Iranian provocations. Close watchers of the region would recall how in 2005, just ahead of an important summit where Saudi Arabia was expected to announce an important concession with Israel in the interest of regional peace, then Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad made that incendiary speech calling for the wiping out of Israel from the face of the earth. To the credit of the Saudis, they have persisted with normalization efforts, culminating with the Abraham Accords 1.0 in 2018. The Accords were a sincere attempt at overcoming this difficult history with statesmanship and enlightened moderation from the UAE, Bahrain, and Oman. Saudi Arabia was all set to join the initiative. Jordan and Egypt have existed at peace with Israel for decades now, and the October 7th setback should not be allowed to derail the ultimate objective of Al-Isra and Miraj. The prophets of the Abrahamic faiths share the same God. Can peace prevail?